Wargaming Campaigns by Henry Hyde. Welcome to Chapter 3 of... I still don't have a name for this campaign. I'm just going to call it the Hyde Campaign. For now, we may change that later once we have developed things a little bit further. Speaking of, we have developed our map a little bit further. I'd like to pause and take a moment to thank all of my supporters. I now have I have a little digital tip jar that I can rattle about and say, alms for the... Well, I'm not poor. Almost for the lower middle class. It's over on Ko-Fi, Ko-Fi. I'll probably forget to put a link in the description. And it's, $5. If you want to buy me a miniature, that'd be great. You don't have to, though. Now, if you do, you'll get quicker access to these videos. I probably have some other goodies and secrets for people that do. And the way it works right now is if you throw $5 in, everything is unlocked for you, at least until I have too many people to keep track of, in which case we may do like a monthly subscription, but that will also assume that I have $5 a month worth of content to give you, and I just don't right now. All I have is a couple of things. One is naming things after you, and that's what we've done. We now have some names for the features on our map. This is still Septemtria. We've already established that, and the nation to the south is Osterregnum. So those countries you already named in a previous video. Since then, a couple of people and they didn't really purchase the commission, so to speak, but by way of additional thank you, we're going to call the capital of Septemtria is going to be named after Captain Hook, which might sound like a weird name, but bear in mind, I live in a state in the Union where there is a literal town called Captain Cook. Not as unheard of as you might think. Captain Hook is probably the guy who was first to set foot on this planet. Remember, we're doing a kind of a traveler-esque, but very detailed, very zoomed-in version. This is Shevlinton, and I've kind of mixed things up a little bit. So the big cities are going to be Hethwill City, Captain Hook, Port Dunder, and then Pylomopolis down up here in the north. And then in the south, as I said, the capital is Shevlinton, and then we have Frogaford right here is the northernmost river crossing, and then we have this is Blacktree down near the woods, and this is Fluid Harbor. Lake Schneider, this is the Anon Forest, and one of these guys, I can't read it on my own. Here, and I've digitized it. This is the Shameless Leech Fens. They are enormous. Remember that 1 inch equals 40 miles, so these are Florida-sized swamps. So 80 miles across, and it continues off the map in this direction. And, we're looking at the 40, 80, 120, 150 miles deep or north to south. That's crazy big. Now, we have to figure out what the next chapter in our story is. All we've established so far is that we have two nations. This is an older nation. This is a southern that split off at some point. There was some fractiousness. And so I would imagine, well, but before we get too much into the history, let's talk about why this matters. We need to know what this war is really about, because the politics of the situation, as a wiser man than I once said, war is politics by other means. I like to think of politics as war by a more peaceful means, but potato, tomato. Point being, if we don't know the political situation, if we don't know why these guys are fighting, we don't know what they're hoping to accomplish, we can't know how to persecute the war for these two factions. So we have to set up a little bit of history. Time out. You could very easily say, well, these guys want to capture this city. And that's a legitimate way to do that, to set up the overall victory conditions for the campaign. That's how William Sylvester does it. That's how Henry Hyde does it, for the most part. Just make something up. And that's fine. But we want to be a little more, we're taking our time here, man. This is what Featherstone called domestic wargaming. We can take all the time we want. We can write a 1,000-year history. We can do a whole bunch of world building. Let's not get too crazy though, right? The ultimate goal is to throw some armies at each other. So we'll take a little bit of a hybrid approach. And what we're going to do is just sketch out the history. Older nation, splitters, it's been 100 years, long enough for this southern nation to really carve out its own identity as separate and distinct from its northern cousins. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? However, the northern cousins have had time to stew and think about, and John, they really They really want to be a unified nation again. Now, over that last 150 years, these two areas have become wealthier. They've become more developed. What were once simply roads have become highways. What were once highways have become rail lines. Additional resources have been found and are currently being exploited. So there's a reason for both of these countries to want to unify, but of course they'll both want to be the top dog of the heap, right? Let's step back a moment. So we've got like an overall general conflict in mind, and in a previous episode, I can't remember if it was the first episode or the second, we took a look at Henry Hyde's vision for using personalities to drive your conflict. We drew a couple of cards. This is on page 282 of Wargaming Campaigns, for those of you following along at home. And we wound up with a brief, sketchy, and rather convoluted political situation. And this is all the notes I have so far. I really need to clean up my notes. We'll get there. I'm just a little bit rushed right now. So the North is led by a fair, loyal, and trusted regent, and it's opposed by a strong opposition. The rightful heir is the ruler in exile. Well, wait a minute. If the leader is fair, then why is the opposition popular and in exile? And the answer to that must be because the opposition cheated and were rightfully forced out of their, well, let's see. They may or may not have been up to some sort of shenanigans, and the fair, loyal regent has said, no, you have to step down, you have to step back, and he was able to push through his policy for whatever reason. But we need to look at the South as well. They are led by an unpopular, dishonest, and repressive regime. The opposition down here doesn't like who's ruling over them. And so this led me to think, but they're opposed by a single, strong, popular Democratic leader. Okay, well, that's interesting. So how do you reconcile those four political parties, right? You got two North, two South. We could draw a third just to have like an additional, maybe it's a parliamentarian style. I'm imagining that these two countries are both relatively recently come out of something like an East India trading company. So, and this being the not too distant future, they've adopted a corporate model of governance. So they have a board of directors and a CEO and an independent oversight corporation. And the leader of that independent oversight corporation up here in the North worked with the opposition or the leading candidate on the board of directors to oust the CEO. And they must have done that in a way that didn't lead to significant bloodshed, because we don't have massive standing armies in either of these countries. They're fairly small given the population and size of these two nations. So that led me to believe, well, wait a minute. If these political parties down here are a leader no one likes, well, but we established from the history that these people are fiercely independent. So that leads me to suspect, what if the two leaders of these countries were in cahoots and they were negotiating a sort of hostile takeover, corporate-wise, if you will, of the southern nation? And the southern nation doesn't want to be taken over by the North. And the North isn't quite comfortable with this because it violates their whatever corporate charter. So at some point, the leader of the North, we should give these guys names, it might make it easier. Leader of the North goes down, and somebody on the board spills the beans on his plot. He's been negotiating with the number one in the South to unify the countries, and then after a set period of time, the leader of the North will step down and the leader of the South will become the supreme commander of the combined Septentrian interregnum nation. Well, somebody spilled the beans, as I said, and that allows the oversight board to declare that the rightful ruler has violated a number of rules of the charter of the nation and is therefore ousted from power. But he's down here with his bodyguards, if you will, his corporate security, which means he's now in exile. He is the rightful ruler, and everyone in the North is happy about this. They're not. So the opposition is strong because there is this very split politics up here in the North. The people are looking at this situation and saying, a lot of them are saying, hey, we had an opportunity for a peaceful resolution and corporate takeover. And a lot of them are saying, yeah, but the rightful ruler wasn't negotiating in good faith, and he was operating outside the limits of his authority. That's not the role of the CEO. That's the role of the whatever position. And so you've got a split up in the North, a political divide, which leads us to the fact that the policy, as we decided in the North, is uncoordinated and erratic, which is a useful factor for balancing the fact that the North is much richer. It can call on much more resources. Now, in the South, you've got kind of the opposite situation where all of these people are mad at the leader for negotiating a settlement. And the leader is now, he says, look, I'm the boss. I'm the guy in charge. What we have to do is get the exiled leader of the North and put him back in the big comfy chair at the head of the board of directors table. So he declares war, and he's got opposition by a single strong, like it says here, a popular democratic leader. So the people aren't excited. Their morale isn't going to be great. On the other hand, this all may be a plot by the dishonest, unpopular, repressive leader of the South. Maybe he's using the leader in the North as a tool. So with all of that said, what you now have is a reason for the South, which is a little bit weaker, to invade the North. Because if they can get to within spitting distance, if they can seize the starport perhaps, then they will shut off any avenue of outside independent arbitration being conducted by, in traveler terms, it would be the Empire. In terms of War Dogs Incorporated, one of my favorite unofficial traveler settings, you can get the audiobook from archaven.com, which is, if you like to listen to the sound of my voice, you're going to love these books. Amor, A-M-O-R, that's the major power that would swoop in. So we have a couple of things going for us by setting this up in that manner. And it's worth pointing out, the dice, the random number generators, the cards in this case, gave us some seemingly contradictory politics that we've been able to resolve that contradiction in a very thematic and, I think, narrative way that directs the war as it is being conducted by those I should have chosen some countries with some shorter names, by those Osterregnums. By the time we get to the 8th or 9th video, Osterregnum is just going to roll right off the tongue. So the Osterregnums are going to be invading the North. And the nice thing about this setup is that we have 4 or 5 interesting victory conditions for the guys in the South. They can be very flexible. The way I see it from looking at the map, they may decide, they already control all of these fens down here. They may decide that they want to take the starport. As I said, if they can control the starport and lay siege to Captain Hook, then they will be able to get their man back on the throne, and they will be able to buy considerable concessions. They may decide they want to seize this crossing of this river right here. If they can seize this village and hold it and lay claim to it, then it cuts off the direct route of the silver to the capital. They may decide, all I got to do is control this junction right here, and I control the silver mine. Or maybe they just grab the silver mine itself. The boys in the North are going to have to defend this area very well. Now, these mountains are largely impassable, so that constrains the conflict, the actual military action. Right about down here is where the mountains start to become passable. This will be slow going getting over this ridge, whereas up here, it's just forget about it. You're not moving an army. You may be able to get a squad or two over there. You can fly over, of course, but you're not going to be able to march over that. And remember, the Osterregnums have very little airlift capacity. This being a modern war set, we'll have to think about supply lines. It might not even be a good idea to dump a major army over here because, hey, you got no way to supply them. That's going to be a problem. Bear in mind, there is also a rather large town down here in the fens. the victory condition for those in the north. They may decide if they can grab this town and occupy it, it's going to be hard to get an army through the fens, and that would shift this line down to here. Maybe they're able to, I doubt they'd be able to grab this town too, but they may be able to take control of this. That's a pretty big town. That's not nothing, right? That would allow for some growth, and that might be useful for them as well, depending on how things shake out. Now, as I said, there were negotiations going on. It was supposed to be a diplomatic mission, a brotherhood of peace, and what was really going on was a lot of cloakroom deals that would sell Osterregnum back down the river, if you will. But the leader of Osterregnum had other plans. I argue that he had already started mobilizing. Now, he hadn't quite sounded like flown the black flag just yet, because, of course, there are spies on either side of the border, but he had all his plans in place so that when his guest was seized, he's going to be able to grab the initiative. He is in much better position to prosecute the war, which is not to say that the guys in the north are caught completely flat-footed, but here's where we, as solo wargamers, turn our attention back to the guidance provided by William Sylvester. In William Sylvester's version of mobilization, he gives us this table. You roll a d6. On a 1, the defender mobilizes at the same time as the attacker. On a 6, the defender mobilizes 5 days after the attacking armies cross the border, which that's my way of saying after the invasion begins. This is not appropriate for us. This is too swingy, too wildly random. We need to find, now we could just arbitrarily decide, but instead we want to let the vagaries of fate take the wheel here. We want to allow for the possibility of some of these, but not all of them. To that end, let's just adjust our die roll. If I roll a single d6 and I get a 1, the defender begins to mobilize at the same time as the attacker. If I roll a 6, the defender begins to mobilize the day the attacker crosses the border. That's the best possible scenario. And then, of course, this will be a 2 or a 3, and this will be a 4 and a 5. On a 2 or a 3, the defender begins to mobilize 5 days after the attacker, which means the attacker, the Osterregnums, will have a 5-day advantage in full mobilization. And then likewise here, the defender begins to mobilize 10 days after, and then mobilizes the same day. So oddly enough, it's pretty good for the defender, and then not so good, then terrible, and then after he crosses, after like the Osterregnum's complete mobilization, they begin their advance, and that's when the guys in the north finally figure out what's going on and what kind of risk they are at. So just like that, we're going to roll a d6. And with a result of a 2, the Septemtrians begin to mobilize 5 days after the attacker begins to mobilize. Well, what does that mean? I would argue, as we've discussed, the guys in the south were, and so basically what happens is the dice confirmed our little story. Each of these nations has a full regiment ready to go in its capital at the start of hostilities. The mobilization begins down here, and then 5 days later, mobilization begins up here. So 5 days go by, the leader of the north is seized, and now the regent sits in the chairman's literal chair. 5 days later, these guys start mobilizing. In our fantasy and black powder campaigns, we had each community generate one or more companies. They then had to march overland to get to their rallying point. And the 4 major cities on each side of the border will be the rallying points. That takes a lot of time because the only power you got to move, you're moving at literally 1 horsepower at the most. Here, We've got cars. We've got trains. Mobilization should happen a lot faster. How much faster? I'm not entirely sure. Kind of depends on the leaders, and this is where things get even more complicated for us. Because we need to know what the characteristics are of each of the commanders of these two forces. Not only that, we need to know what the characteristics are for each of the regiments, the 4 and 5 regiments that we've got, so we can know what their initiative is. And the higher the initiative, the more likely they are to be ready to go. But I think the important thing to be aware of is that the commanders of the Home Guard, those 2 armies will start here. And the instant that hostilities are apparent, that on day 5, there's going to be these 2 units that can start moving immediately. And I would argue that this one unit can set out immediately, can strike out and really seize the initiative and maybe get up into this area while the home defense is already mobilizing. So they're going to get they're going to be able to steal a 5-day march. And that would change the complexion of the campaign as well. I'm not sure if that's what's going to happen because we need to figure out our leaders. And I think that's going to be the subject of our next. We didn't do a whole lot today. So the 2 things that I'm going to do, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to draw up some orders of battle. And I'm going to figure out which units are going where. And don't forget, in addition to the major regiments, the leg infantry, the support vehicles, 1 unit of artillery, and a unit of tanks, and I got to figure out which tanks start where. We'll probably start the heavy tanks in the big industrial cities. But we also need to figure out, like, maybe we just do the overall commander of the land forces, the air forces, and the sea forces. Because we also have to figure out what's going to happen here on the water front, where the guys in the south are outnumbered 2-1. They may be able to get down here and blockade this little village here, and that might prevent any crossing of the armies at this major crossing here. Or we may decide that, well, there's already 1 or 2 boats here. We got to bring the other 3 up. How long is that going to take to mobilize those boats? And then we have to fight a battle to find out what happens on this side of on this front of the war. And then we also have to figure out what the weather is. So we got a lot going on here. I'm going to go ahead and compile some of this stuff offline. So stay tuned for that. And in our next episode, we'll have a much better understanding of what the forces are. The only thing I'm going to declare right now is that the Osterregnums are going to try to blockade this port and this river opening. They're going to it's basically holding the pass, right? They're outnumbered by 2-1. If they can control this area here, they may be able to completely negate that ability. Once the Air Force comes online, that may go away as our Navy for the Osterregnums has to stay within a couple of miles of the anti-air guns here in Fluid Harbor. So the day that the hostilities, war is declared, we're going to war, this Navy sets out to blockade the port. This regiment moves out. Better yet, let's go ahead and figure out what the stats are, the characteristics for the leader of that strike force that's heading out for the mines to seize the high ground or the rail junction for the silver mines. The commanders will each have 6 characteristics: intelligence, initiative, courage, charisma, strength, and health. So I'm going to roll percentile dice 6 times. And we get, I better write this down as I go so I don't forget. We get an intelligence of 49. So this commander has average intelligence. I get an average result for initiative. And that is the important number for the question of the day. He gets his orders and he moves out, not with lightning speed. He doesn't drag his feet. He says, okay, I'm going to take a day and make sure everything is in order, and then we're going to get moving. His courage is 83. You cannot fault him for his courage. His charisma is 81. He's crazy strong. Let's see, wisdom, courage, charisma, strength. So we got 83, 92, and then for health, oh boy, here it comes. we get an 88. So very robust. So what we have here is a man's man, a soldier's soldier, really outstanding. And he's the overall commander of the forces of Oster-Regnum, which explains why this despot was so confident that his forces could win despite being outnumbered. When you've got a hoss like that in command, like I said, they're going to move out, not quickly, not slowly. I would argue, he says, oh, it's time? All right, well, we've got one unit ready. He assays the situation and says, yeah, tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., you guys head out. Now, they have to go a total of, to reach the railhead here, from wherever that army base is. And I would argue there's probably a military fortress up here overlooking the heights that helps command this little pass here through the river. So if we say it's about 2.5 inches, it's going to be about 100 miles. And if we go back to March to Glory rules for movement, remember, we don't have mechanized infantry, we have leg infantry. If they are in half tracks, I think that's a reasonable supposition. And bear in mind, I've only drawn the major highways here. There's probably scattered farms and little small towns and settlements and a road network everywhere, but you're not going to be able to move at highway speeds. So that's what the dashed lines and the heavy lines are. So they have to kind of go through, in the American parlance, it would be the state roads, little whistle stops. However, they are military. They're not worried about getting a speeding ticket. So even having to go 100 miles, if you take a look at this, the movement points in half tracks, and I think the distinction here, and I'm not a modern warfare guy, that mechanized infantry are going to be in armored fighting vehicles. This would be the speed for the tanks as well. I think we go with the slower speed. The half tracks is basically motorized infantry, but they're not in fighting vehicles in any sense of the word. But even at that, they're going to be able to cover, 15 movement points. That's 75 miles in a day. So they're going to be able to bivouac somewhere around here. And on day, so if day 1 goes by, they travel day 2, by day 3, that army is going to be right here, and they're going to be able to seize that railhead. Now, why is that important? Because they're going to be able to move their company of gendarmes up to seize the silver mines and take control. How long will that take? I'm not sure. That's another question we have to answer. I'm gonna pause here. We already have our first activity, and these guys are going to have plenty of time to set up a defensive position here that will allow them, depending on which direction they get attacked from, they may decide to just armor up right here. But I think the goal is to armor here, because that way they can take a defensive stance and kind of patrol this whole gap between the lake and the mountains. Interesting stuff. Meanwhile, how long does it take these guys to mobilize? It kind of depends on the commanders. It kind of depends on the dice. That'll be the first question that we answer in our next video. Until then, I'm praying for you.